On November the 14th, 1887, the noon thermometer nailed outside the Coldwater Rail Office stood at 11 degrees, and the wind came straight down the open Wyoming flats hard enough to lift grit from frozen ruts and strike faces like thrown shot. Coldwater held 312 souls that season, a settlement strung along one rail spur, one muddy street, a church, a smithy, a schoolhouse, and the general store where most judgments were made long before facts arrived. Men measured prospects by cattle count and wagon traffic, women by flour levels and lamp oil, and every household by what could be brought in before snow sealed the approaches. In that country, weather was not scenery, but law. It did not negotiate, it only arrived. At the north edge of town, where alkali crust flashed pale through scrubgrass and spring runoff, left bitter rings in the soil, 19-year-old Cole Thornton swung a mattock into frozen ground and worked without witness or complaint. The 10 acres had sold for $48 after the sheriff closed the effects of Asa Thornton, deceased, and most in Coldwater called it a mercy sale to clear useless land from the record book. A rancher had laughed that no calf would fatten there, and a carpenter had said no prudent man would set a foundation on such poor earth. Cole bought it anyway, paid in counted bills and coins, and led his tools out at first light the next day. He had been orphaned by 12, though not abandoned to chance. Asa Thornton had trapped winter lines through high timber and hauled freight teams between upland camps and rail depots, and he had raised his son in weather that punished boasting and rewarded memory. The father had spoken plainly, repeating lessons until they became habit. Livestock was wealth only when hay, grain, and shelter could outlast a long freeze. A barrel of flour mattered more than a fine saddle in January. Towns did not fail first from snowdrift, but from bare shelves and empty cellars. Asa had learned those truths from his own mother in the Tennessee Hill Country, then tested them year after year in Wyoming storms that took careless men by inches and then by breath. Knowledge in that line had not passed as theory. It had passed as survival. When Asa died under a wagon near South Fork in late spring of 1880, there had been no dramatic inheritance, only tools, a ledger with careful columns, one silver watch, and a son old enough to read prices and weather signs. Cole hired out where he could, first splitting ties, later riding freight with mule teams, and he spent 7 years learning the arithmetic of scarcity. A paid day at $1.10 might become 80 cents after meals. A sack of good flour at normal rates could run $4.25 in a decent year and climb higher when roads turned foul. Nails, if bought by the keg, cost less by weight than loose handfuls from a store scoop. Salt, vinegar, lamp oil, and dry grain were never cheap in a place that waited on rails and wagon trains, but they were always cheaper in August than in January. Cole learned that timing itself was a form of labor. Coldwater did not know what to do with a quiet young man who spent wages on staples instead of pleasures and who answered taunts with silence. He did not linger in card rooms. He did not argue in public. At church, when he attended, he took the rear bench and left without joining talk in the yard. Many mistook reserve for weakness because they had not seen him on a freight line in sleet, or waking every 2 hours to keep a mule team moving in drifted dark. What they saw was a thin young man with wind-burned cheeks, steady eyes, and hands calloused to the grain. What they did not see was discipline built from winter routines no one applauded. By late November of that year, Cole had set his first stakes for a barn where no herd would stand. He stretched twine lines with an iron tape, marked out a rectangle 60 feet long and 34 feet wide, and measured every corner twice before he drove the final guide peg. The foundation trenches went down 30 inches where soil allowed, and deeper where frost had already stiffened the upper crust. He lined bearing points with fieldstone hauled from a dry creek bend 2 miles west. Each load brought in a narrow wagon he repaired himself. There was no flourish in the design. There was intention in every board. He framed double plank walls with a 6-inch cavity between inner and outer sheathing, then packed that cavity with dry sawdust purchased in sacks from the mill yard at 12 cents per sack, because trapped air and dry fill held warmth more faithfully than bragging about thick coats. On the windward side, he added a second interior partition, creating a dead space where cold could spend itself before reaching stored food. He set raised slat floors 18 inches above grade so air could move beneath barrels and sacks, reducing rot and keeping ground damp from climbing into grain. Along the north wall, he dug stone-lined cooling pits 4 feet deep, each capped with fitted plank lids for roots and preserved jars that required steadier temperatures than a common loft could provide. He built vent chases with shutters that could be narrowed by hand, 1 notch at a time, to draw out damp breath without stripping the building of heat. A team of 3 might have done the work in 6 weeks. Cole did it alone over months, hauling, cutting, fitting, and checking each joint by lamplight. He paid for what he could not make. A keg of square nails cost $6.40 at prevailing rate. Strap hinges for heavy doors cost 85 cents each, and he bought 8. Pine planks in mixed lengths ran $23 for the first wagon lot and $19 for the second, after he accepted rougher cuts and planed them himself. For goods that would fill the structure, he kept a separate tally: flour barrels, dried beans, oats, rendered tallow in sealed tins, lamp oil in protected cans, smoked venison on elevated racks, and cordwood stacked by species and burn time. He wrote date, weight, source, and expected use in Asa Thornton's old ledger, now bound with rawhide at the corners where the spine had worn through. The writing was careful, almost severe. Winter, he had been taught, was a creditor who always collected. By the first week of January 1888, snow had come and gone twice without closing the town, and the comments around Coldwater grew sharper. Men on the boardwalk asked where Cole planned to stable his phantom herd. Boys repeated the joke and pointed at the half-finished structure as though its emptiness proved foolishness. A pair of teamsters called it a warehouse for fears and advised him to buy calves before spring. Cole continued to lift, stack, seal, and count. On one bitter morning, when a freight driver asked why he tolerated mockery, Cole rested a sack against his hip and said, "I would rather stack than argue." Work advanced by increments that looked small from the road and immense from inside the frame. He installed a hand-cranked hoist on a crossbeam 12 feet above floor level, tested with stones and then with grain sacks, so one worker could move 200-pound loads without burning strength needed for other tasks. He built interior bays 9 feet wide, marked by painted numerals and tied to ledger pages, each bay assigned by shelf life and handling need rather than by market value. Items prone to mold stayed nearest vent control. Fats and oils sat in cooler shadow. Fuel remained far from lamp stores, separated by plank barriers and clear walking lanes to reduce spills and fire risk during ordinary work. The arrangement looked excessive to visitors who expected loose stacks and quick trade. It looked exact to a man planning for a hard season. Spring brought mud and wagon noise, then summer heat, then another cycle of buying and storing. Every freight run Cole took ended with coin converted to staples, never idle. He bartered trapping pelts for rye and lard when cash ran thin. He felled and dressed his own timber for loft reinforcement rather than paying finished lumber rates. By August, the barn on alkali ground stood broad and square against the ridge wind, clean-sided, practical, and full of purpose that most neighbors still refused to name. They saw no cattle in the stalls because there were no stalls at all. They saw no hayloft for horses because the loft carried sacks and sealed bins. They called it waste. Cole called it preparation only by continuing to prepare. When September neared and geese began crossing lower and earlier than many recalled, Coldwater still trusted the habit of ordinary years. Cole Thornton trusted measurements, dates, and the memory of a father who had buried too many men who thought one mild week meant safety. On September 3rd, 1888, a dry wind came through Coldwater carrying dust instead of rain, and the board outside the North Platte rail office rattled against its nails, while men gathered to read a fresh notice in the clerk's hand. Bridge washouts in Nebraska had delayed freight 12 days already, the paper said, and further interruption should be expected if autumn storms struck before repairs held. The posting was short, almost polite, but in a town built on one rail spur and one muddy street, it carried the weight of a verdict. Flour did not grow on the boardwalk. Lamp oil did not rise from frozen ground. What arrived by car and wagon could be counted. What failed to arrive became hunger by arithmetic. Cole stood at the edge of that knot of readers with his hat brim low and his hands bare, despite the morning chill, listening to arguments form before anyone had reached the bottom line. One man said delays always sounded worse on paper than in practice. Another said there was still time before deep winter. Cole said only that geese had crossed lower this year, in tighter formations, and 3 days earlier than his ledger recorded for the last 6 seasons. He added that hair coats had thickened too soon, and that beaver dams upstream stood higher than spring flood marks. The remarks were plain, offered without theater. They were met with smiles that did not reach the eyes. Silas Pemberton arrived in a broadcloth coat, dark as ink, and boots polished so clean they caught sunlight where the rest of the street absorbed it, and he made room for himself by presence more than courtesy. He read the same notice and folded it as if the paper belonged to him, then spoke loud enough for the blacksmith and the schoolchildren and the teamsters near the hitch rail. Coldwater had weathered cold before, he said. Freight delays were inconvenience, not prophecy. Then he turned toward Cole and gave the line that would follow the town all winter. Thornton's empty stable was fit for beans and fears, not for real work. Laughter moved down the plank walk in quick bursts, a social current stronger than reason because it offered belonging. By the second week of September, Pemberton's mockery had hardened into policy at the general store counter. A flour sack that sold to ranch wives for $4.25 cost Cole $7, and bulk salt that others bought by clean measure came to him short by nearly a pound, unless he demanded a reweigh. Lamp oil tins were set aside before he arrived, then restored to the shelf when he left. Pemberton explained the changes as risk pricing for unusual buyers in unusual quantities, words dressed in commerce but sharpened by contempt. Cole did not protest in speeches. He paid when he could, marked the inflated figures in Asa Thornton's ledger, and adjusted his plans line by line. When cash thinned to almost nothing, he sold his father's silver watch to a railroad mechanic for $11, wrapped the coins in cloth, and carried them directly to the store for vinegar, rye, and nails. The watch sale might have looked small to men who measured life by acreage, yet it was the last object from Asa Thornton that held both use and memory, and the transfer had the quiet finality of closing a door that would not open again. Asa had taught his son that sentiment could guide judgment, but could never substitute for supplies. He had also taught him that the hardest discipline in scarcity was choosing what to part with first. Cole had learned from those lessons in timber camps where teams survived on rationed oats and in trap lines where one missed repair meant losing a week's catch to thaw. In Asa's method, there was no romance about hardship. There was sequence, secure shelter, secure fuel, secure food that kept, secure water that did not poison, then help others in the same order. Cole followed the chain as if his father were still pacing beside him, naming each priority in the dark. He cut his own timber along a draw west of town, where cottonwood and scrub pine twisted low under wind pressure, felling by hand, trimming by moonrise, and hauling lengths on a narrow wagon axle he had sleeved with salvaged iron to keep it from cracking under load. The second loft in the barn required joists 16 feet long, planed enough to seat true but left thick for weight bearing. He set rafters to 18 feet at the crown, then installed vent chutes with adjustable baffles made from pine scraps and leather hinges so humidity could be shifted without opening doors in storm weather. Along the east wall, he sealed cistern barrels with clay collars to prevent freeze creep at the staves, and he raised each barrel on stone pavers to keep base wood dry. The hoist mechanism he had mounted in spring received a new gear tooth, cut from hickory, reducing slip when lifting 200-pound sacks from wagon bed to loft bay by one man's crank strength alone. Late in September, Ruth Hale came to the barn near dusk with a scarf wrapped over her hair and a tin pail she held as pretense for the walk. She was 12, narrow-shouldered with soot at one cuff from helping in her father's forge, and she asked whether medicine could be kept from freezing in the stone pits if winter turned hard. Her mother's lungs had worsened, she said, and bottles left near their kitchen wall had gone slushy on cold nights, even before true winter. Cole took her to the north wall and lifted one fitted lid, showing the depth, the stone lining, and the straw insulation packed between lid boards, then told her to bring any tinctures or powders when nights dropped below 10 degrees, and he would reserve a marked crate. He did not call this charity. He called it proper storage. 3 days passed before Ruth returned with 2 wrap bottles and a folded note from her father, Eli Hale, asking the same question in a blacksmith's blunt hand, and adding, almost as an afterthought, that he could forge extra strap hinges if needed. That was the first crack in Coldwater's certainty that Cole was preparing only for himself. He answered with work, not proclamation. He reorganized the interior bays by ration class for 300 souls, not one household, using chalk marks on beam posts and corresponding entries in the ledger: staple grain, preserved vegetables, rendered fat, fuel allotment, medicinal reserve, infant and infirm priority. One full bay nearest the warm wall became restricted stock for families with infants and the sick, and he posted weights above each bin so distribution could be done by measure rather than favor. By late October, the structure on alkali ground looked less like eccentricity and more like infrastructure, though few used that word. The double-plank walls had settled tight. The sawdust insulation remained dry under test borings. Floor slats rang hard under boots and showed no mold at their undersides. Cole ran a trial of door closures in rising wind, timing each latch throw and brace set, then replaced 2 ordinary hinges with iron straps from Hale's forge, where twist stress showed at the pins. He drove anchor posts on the windward side and stretched tarred rope from barn to well and back in fixed lines, each knot spaced for gloved hands so a soul could count distance when sight vanished. Children laughed at the ropes in clear weather and called them mule tethers for a herd that did not exist. Cole marked their knots in the ledger anyway. The social penalties sharpened with the cold. Church suppers stopped extending invitations to the Thornton place, even when surplus stew remained. 2 ranch hands tipped spoiled hay at his gate one Saturday and rode off laughing before dawn, leaving sour rot that he forked into a trench for compost because waste still had use if handled correctly. Women in the store line lowered voices when he entered. Boys repeated Pemberton's name for the barn in sing-song cadence by the school fence. A freight teamster, not unkind and not brave, asked once why he allowed the town to grind at him this way. Cole lifted a flour sack to the second tier, set it square, and answered in a tone fit for weather reports. Let them talk. Words do not feed a town in January. On November the 19th, 1888, noon temperatures rose to 46 degrees for 2 straight days, warm enough to soften the top inch of road mud and pull men into shirt sleeves for optimism they had not earned. Pemberton stood outside his store and announced that panic had spent itself, then sold sugar and coffee on credit to households already thin on coin, promising settlement after spring calves and rail receipts. He refused to renew his coal order, calculating that freight costs would cut margins more deeply than a short, cold snap ever could. The town breathed easier, because relief is always persuasive when it arrives in fair light. Cole used the thaw for tasks that required unfrozen ground. He buried 3 additional root bins at 42 inches depth, reinforced both main doors with diagonal braces and iron straps, and retensioned guide ropes from barn to well until each line sang when plucked. By the 4th day after the warm spell, telegraph service failed west of Cheyenne, and no confirming dispatch reached Coldwater for 48 hours. Then sleet came in hard needles at dusk, turned to driving snow by midnight, and erased wheel tracks by dawn. Freight halted entirely. Wagon teams from the south did not appear. In Pemberton's store, shelves that had seemed generous at sunup, thinned by lantern light as coffee, flour, and lamp wicks moved out in armloads to frightened households. Coal bins, never replenished, dropped to plank bottoms. Kerosene tins froze at their mouths when stoves failed. In the barn on alkali ground, inventory stood at figures Cole had revised twice and tested against 90 days of controlled issue. 14,000 pounds of staple stores, 9 cords of split wood stacked by burn rate, 640 quarts of preserved vegetables, medicinal crates in pit storage, and a ration schedule tied to population need rather than social standing. On the evening of November the 26th, wind struck from the north with a force that bent smoke flat along rooflines before lifting it apart. Cole made one final pass through the aisles with a lantern hooded low, checking seals, latch pins, stove flues, and water barrels. Then copied the next day's distribution table on a clean ledger page in case damp took the older ink. Ruth Hale arrived just after dark with a wrapped bundle of cough draft for her mother and stood under the eave while snow began to hiss across the yard. Cole handed her the nearest guide rope and showed her where to keep one glove on the line at all times between barn and road. Pride, he said, had no weight value in a storm and no heat value either. She nodded once and carried the instruction home. Before first light on November the 27th, 1888, Coldwater crossed the threshold from warning to event, and the question before every household ceased to be whether Thornton's empty stable had been folly. The question became whether pride would permit them to cross its door before winter finished taking its due. The wind struck again, harder than the first blow, and the barn answered with a low timber groan that Cole had expected and prepared for, not as a sign of failure but as the sound of load transferring through braces set precisely for this strain. He stepped into the main aisle, lifted the lantern higher, and moved station by station with a practice sequence. North latch pins seated, west shutter baffles narrowed to 2 fingers, stove flue draft half open, ash bucket clear, water lids fastened, walkway sanded. On the chalkboard beside the central post, he wrote the opening ration figures in block numerals large enough to read in dim light. Flour, 6 ounces per soul per day. Beans, 4 ounces. Oats by household size and labor demand. Lamp oil by shared room, not private claim. He hung a second slate beneath it with 3 instructions that admitted no exception in storm weather. 1 line on every crossing. 1 roster at every meal count. 1 stove watcher each 4-hour watch. At the first gray of morning, Eli Hale came through the blowing white with a coil of chain over one shoulder and a hammer tucked under his coat, not as a man paying a social debt, but as a blacksmith reporting for duty under terms he now recognized as sound. He set new hook eyes in the windward doorframe, drove spikes through the rope cleats that had held all autumn, and checked each fastening by body weight until the wood complained and settled. Cole assigned him the furnace corner and gave him a task list copied from ledger page 93, with item weights and draw order down to quarter-sack increments. Ruth arrived 10 minutes later carrying wrapped medicine crates from her mother's shelf, and those bottles went directly to the stone pit bay marked Infirm Reserve. No one spoke idly. The storm took words and flung them back in fragments. Work continued in gestures, chalk marks, and the steady sound of tools striking where they were meant to strike. By mid-morning on November the 27th, visibility had fallen below 20 feet on open ground, and the guide ropes that had drawn laughter in clear weather became the only geometry left in cold water. Cole tied a second line from the barn corner to the well post, then another to the lee side of the smithy, creating a three-point path so no crossing required blind wandering in open gust lanes. He measured each span by knot count, 17 knots to the well, 29 to the smithy, with a doubled knot at each turn point that could be felt through mittens. Inside, he widened aisle clearances by shifting 2 grain stacks 6 inches east and 2 inches north, enough for bundled travelers to pass without catching sleeves and toppling stores. He moved lamp tins from shelf level to floor cradles, packed with sand to reduce break risk, and he set a drip pan beneath every hanging pot so thaw water would not slick the plank floor where tired boots could slide. The project, mocked as static and strange, proved in those hours to be a living system, adjustable under pressure because it had been built by method rather than optimism. The first household to arrive was not the proudest or the poorest, but the most practical, widow Martha Bell with 2 grown daughters and a flour scoop, wrapped in cloth as if she feared appearing to ask for more than she deserved. Cole took their names, assigned bunk boards along the inner wall where heat held longest, and recorded their entry time at 9:40 in the ledger margin. 2 ranch hands followed, the same men who had once tipped spoiled hay at his gate, their hats crusted white and their ears raw with cold, and they stood uncertain near the door until Eli pointed them toward the woodstack and said they could begin by carrying what would keep the room alive. By noon, 7 households had crossed, then 9, then 12, each guided by rope and counted at the threshold. Cole weighed each issue on a hanging scale and announced the measure without comment on status. A banker's wife received no more than a dray driver. A church deacon took his allotment from the same scoop as a laundrywoman. The ledger did not recognize rank. It recognized consumption, shelf life, and the mathematics of survival. Outside, the street that had served as Coldwater's stage for mockery emptied to pale blur and flying grit of ice. At the general store, Silas Pemberton attempted business by habit, opening his front counter and quoting emergency prices from the doorway while wind drove snow through the cracks in his own frame walls. He had lit 2 stoves but lacked coal to keep either at stable heat, and when kerosene mouths froze, he sent a clerk to break the seals with warm nails. By afternoon, families who had stood in his line retreated with less than they had hoped to buy, and more fear than they had brought. A woman asked whether he could match ration terms at the barn, and received a hard answer about private property and proper payment. The old language of leverage spoken into weather that no longer cared who held account books in fair months. She turned away and took the rope path instead. Mockery persisted even then, though it changed from easy laughter to brittle accusation, and that transformation revealed its underlying shape. One man shouted from the lee of Pemberton's awning that Cole had courted panic for personal importance. Another claimed the rope network forced souls to pass his threshold by design, as if wind direction could be arranged by a 19-year-old with a hammer and a ledger. 2 voices at the church steps argued that communal aid should flow through established committees, not through a private barn built by a boy who had refused supper invitations and kept to himself. Yet those same voices lowered when gusts rose and doors shook on their hinges. By late afternoon, 3 of the loudest critics arrived, carrying bedrolls and 1 crate of mismatched canned fruit, offering the crate as contribution and avoiding Cole's eyes while he assigned them to stove watch and water melt rotation. He did not answer their earlier words. He put tools in their hands. A little after sunset, as the thermometer fixed by the barn door dropped through -12 and kept falling, Pemberton himself came along the rope line with his coat collar turned high and 2 clerks behind him bearing ledgers wrapped in oilcloth. He entered with the posture of a man still expecting precedence and discovered at once that the interior order admitted no ceremonial place for him. Cole showed him the wash station, then the woodpile, then the barrel pump, and finally the roster board where every new arrival signed name, household count, and labor capacity. Pemberton hesitated over the labor line until Eli placed a pencil in his hand and said, "Split wood, carry water, inventory under supervision." The merchant wrote the words with careful penman strokes, now reduced to practical admission. He asked where he should sleep. Cole pointed to an open bunk near the draft baffle and said proximity to cold would encourage brisk work at dawn. Through that first night, the warning signs that had been dismissed for months stood vindicated in relentless sequence. The deep beaver dams had foretold sustained runoff freeze and heavy drift pattern. Now snow packed in layered ridges exactly where Cole had marked likely choke points on his map board in October. The early geese flights had indicated a sharp pressure change and long cold track from the north. Now barometric drop and wind angle held without relief, locking storm bands over the settlement. The thick hair coats had signaled prolonged severe temperatures, and by midnight the interior porch thermometer, sheltered from direct gust, read -26. Cole walked the walls each hour, palm against planks to detect cold intrusion lines, and adjusted vent shutters by fractions to balance damp removal against heat loss. Condensation formed where too many bodies breathed in one room. He answered by opening high baffles 1 notch and increasing stove rotation, accepting greater wood burn to avoid lung sickness and mold bloom. Preparation was no longer theory tested against ridicule. It was maintenance under continuous load. By the second day of storm, November 28th, the barn population reached 143 souls by noon count, and the system expanded without breaking because it had been designed from the beginning to scale by bay, not by hope. Cole opened the reserve loft and posted a revised ration chart tied to projected duration at 9 days and possible extension to 12 if roads failed after snowfall ceased. He converted 1 aisle into an infirm lane with privacy screens stitched from old grain sacks and set Ruth to label medicine parcels by hour and dose under her mother's direction, a task she handled with steady hands and clear script. Eli forged 2 pothooks from salvage iron at a makeshift brazier, so larger kettles could run simultaneously for broth and sterilized water. Women who had once crossed streets to avoid speaking to Cole now managed bread rotations, each loaf tagged by household size. Ranch hands who had mocked the empty stalls carried night soil to trench pits 50 yards downwind, following rope and marker stakes in pairs for safety and sanitation. Community dismissal did not disappear in a single revelation. It eroded, then fell away under repeated evidence. A teacher who had called the barn uncivilized asked for ledger methods to track school coal in winter. A preacher who had warned against fear-driven hoarding spent an hour reweighing bean sacks and publicly corrected his own earlier estimate of need. Pemberton attempted once to reserve extra sugar for preferred customers, and Cole denied the request without raising his voice, then assigned the merchant to standard flour issue, where every measure was visible. The lesson moved through the room not by speech but by procedure. Rules applied evenly. Supplies held. The walls held. When disputes rose, Cole returned each argument to three numbers: current stock, daily draw, probable duration. Disagreement could continue. Arithmetic would remain unchanged. Toward evening on the second day, a lull came, brief and deceptive, with wind dropping enough that some believed the worst had passed, and talk stirred of returning home to recover furniture and private stores. Cole stopped that movement with a practical demonstration at the threshold, opening the outer door for 20 seconds while two men held ropes at full strain. Snow entered in a white sheet, needles hard as sand, and the room temperature dropped 4 degrees before the latch closed again. He pointed to the thermometer, to the drift already climbing against the south wall, and to the sky where the light had gone from gray to iron blue that always preceded renewed violence on those plains. No sermon followed. He posted travel ban until morning evaluation and set additional watch pairs. Night returned with greater force, wind now a continuous roar that erased separate sounds and made timber vibration part of the air itself. Inside, chores cycled by, bell mark and chalk tally. Feed the stove, skim the melt pot, check the infirm bay, log issue weights, clear ash, sweep spills, turn bedding, count souls. Cole took the middle watch near 2 in the morning, walked the aisles with a hooded lamp, and paused at the main doors where fresh snow pressed in seams, but the braces held true. Behind him, 143 souls slept, coughed, whispered, or waited. Ahead of him, storm law still ruled the prairie. The barn, with no animals, stood full of exactly what he had said it was for, and every passing hour translated old ridicule into a quieter, harder understanding that would not be spoken fully until weather released its grip. That understanding was tested within the hour, when a gust line struck from the northwest with such force that the barn doors shuddered against their iron straps, and a deep crack rolled across town like rifle fire, though it came from timber failing, not from guns. Cole moved to the threshold rope, counted to 20 between gusts, and sent Eli Hale and 2 ranch hands in tied pairs toward the nearest houses where lantern signals had ceased. They returned with 8 souls and 1 frost-stiff dog, then went out again for 6 more, while the wind erased every track behind them before the door could be barred. In the same interval, the church belfry lost its upper louvers, the schoolhouse chimney sheared at the roofline, and a freight shed by the rail spur collapsed inward, under drift weight no one could clear in that weather. Cold water had entered the phase where sturdy plans became debris, and weak plans became graves. By dawn on November the 29th, the thermometer on Cole's lee wall read -32, and the barometer he had borrowed from the rail office before the storm now sat at a pressure drop that old teamsters recognized with silence. Snow had climbed to window height on the east side of the general store and to eave height along 3 boardwalk facades, burying steps, hitch rails, and 2 wagons in place as if they had been cast into plaster. Pemberton attempted to reopen his own building with 4 men and shovels, but when they forced the front door, the interior offered no relief. Kerosene had gelled in its tins, the coal bin was empty to bare plank, and flour in open sacks had wicked moisture and frozen in hard gray clumps. He stood in that doorway in his once fine broadcloth, coat now streaked with slush and ash, and watched families bypass him for the guide rope that led uphill to the barn he had named for ridicule. His authority did not end in a speech. It thinned with each passing figure that did not look back. Inside the barn, population rose to 171 souls by noon count, then 186 by evening, and the room changed from emergency shelter into a disciplined encampment governed by measurement, sanitation, and labor rotation. Cole established 3 stove circles instead of 2, assigning elders and infants to the warmest arc, while able-bodied adults took perimeter bunks near draft seams. He ordered meal service by bell not by clamor, and posted a new ration slate after calculating fuel burn at increased occupancy, flour reduced by ½ ounce per soul, beans held steady, rendered fat increased for night watches, broth prioritized for infirm lanes. Ruth Hale copied medicine schedules in a hand, now trusted by households who had once dismissed her errands as childish worry. Eli ran a repair corner where split handles, broken boot hooks, and bent hinges were restored because replacement was no longer a market purchase, but a survival task. The first death came near sunset that same day, and it carried the weight of a warning ignored too long. Deputy Martin Keene had left the church annex at midday with a shovel, insisting he could cross to an outlying coal cache without guideline because he had walked those yards in every season for 6 years. 2 boys saw him disappear into drift glare near the parsonage fence. No one saw him again until a rope team found him after dark, 30 paces from the church door, one glove off where he had reached for a latch buried under snow. They brought him to Cole's threshold still and white with frost in his beard, and Reverend Talbot removed his hat with hands that shook despite the heat. Keene had been a broad-shouldered man who settled disputes at the stock pens with a calm word and a firm stance. He had left behind a wife, Nora, and a daughter grown and married in Laramie. The barn fell silent while his name was entered in the ledger margin beside the date and temperature, not as spectacle, but as record. 3 days into the blizzard, with no break in wind and no rail signal from the south, Coldwater's ordinary hierarchy had dissolved into a simpler order measured by who could carry, mend, boil, and endure. Pemberton reported for wood detail before dawn and stayed there through both watches, his hands blistered through gloves not built for labor, while one of his former clerks hauled slop buckets and scrubbed floor sand where meltwater pooled. No one mocked him. No one spared him. Cole gave him the same allotment and the same tasks as any other able-bodied man, and when Pemberton attempted to argue for private access to his remaining sugar stock, Eli answered that sugar without heat was vanity and returned him to the splitting block. Outside, the merchant's store windows went opaque with interior frost, shelves visible only as pale ribs behind ice. The empty shelf confidence of autumn had become a frozen room no one could eat. On the night of December 1st, during a gust cycle that bent the rope line nearly horizontal, a boarding house runner reached the barn with his coat torn at the shoulder and reported roof failure at Lydia Crow's place on Lower Street. Lydia had operated the house for 9 winters, taking miners, drummers, and railmen in fair weather and hard, and she had refused early evacuation because her younger brother Daniel lay fevered and could not stand without help. Cole organized a rescue pair at once, then a second pair when the first reported blocked entry, and they moved by knots and shouted counts through blowing white to breach the lee wall with axes. They got Daniel out wrapped in quilts and sledged him behind 2 men to the guideline. Lydia did not come with him. She had held a support post while they worked the brother free. When the roof timbers shifted the second time, she was pinned beneath fallen planks and packed snow before they could drag her clear. They carried her in after midnight, laid her near the infirm lane, and Ruth covered her with a clean blanket while Daniel, half-conscious, called her name into the wind noise and received no answer. In morning count, Cole wrote Lydia Crow, deceased, and adjusted bunks to place Daniel near steady heat and watch care. By December 3rd, the 7th day since first impact, strain showed on every face in the barn, yet the system still functioned because its rules held even when spirits faltered. Water teams advanced and returned by rope on fixed intervals. Ash was removed before overflow. Latrine trench markers were reset each shift as drifts rose. A mother whose lamp oil had run out days earlier wept in gratitude over 1 measured spoon of tallow for a wick. 2 ranch families shared 1 cast iron pot and 1 narrow bunk shelf, without quarrel, because there was no spare space for pride. The contrast between prepared and unprepared life had grown stark enough to humble even the stubborn. In one building, ration boards and controlled heat sustained nearly 200 souls. Across town, private cupboards once considered ample had gone empty or frozen solid by the third day. What Cole had built as a barn without animals had become the only functioning granary, infirmary, and winter command post in Coldwater. Help came sought not in whispers, but in a raw, breaking plea near dusk that same day, when Owen Pike staggered up the rope path dragging a hand sled on which lay his son, Samuel Pike, 7 years old, wrapped in 2 damp quilts and shaking with fever that had deepened after 48 hours in an unheated shack by the rail cut. Owen and his family had delayed, believing the storm would pass and ashamed to request aid from the place they had mocked in October. Shame had not warmed the room. By the time he reached Cole's door, his lips were blue, and his first words were not apology, but urgency. Save him if you can. Cole and Ruth moved Samuel into the infirm lane immediately, stripped wet layers, set warmed stones at feet and sides, and began broth by spoon while Eli cleared space for a second cot. Pemberton, hearing the name, brought his own remaining coffee sack for poultice heat without being asked. A gesture too late to erase past conduct, but not too late to matter in that hour. Samuel Pike was 7, slight as a fence rail under the blankets and burning hot despite the cold that had settled deep in him. He surfaced once near midnight, asked in a thin voice whether his mother was inside, and accepted Cole's answer that she had reached shelter. He nodded, exhaled, and didn't fully wake again. Ruth kept his pulse notes on scrap paper through the dark watch while Reverend Talbot sat with the Pike family at dawn, hat in both hands, saying little because little would alter what cold and delay had done. Samuel Pike died just after first light on December 4th, with Owen gripping the cot rail and repeating that he should have come sooner, should have come on the first day, should have come when the ropes were first posted. Cole closed Samuel's ledger line with the same neat hand he used for flour weights, because grief did not remove the duty to record. The storm itself began to weaken by degrees that afternoon, not with mercy but with exhaustion, wind dropping from a constant howl to hard pulses, then to long moans between quieter intervals. Drifts remained shoulder high. Temperatures stayed below -20 after sunset. Yet for the first time in 9 days, lantern light from 3 separate buildings could be seen through the white from Cole's upper vent slit, and rope teams made crossings without crawling. Pemberton stood at the wood stack, thinner than when the week began, and asked Cole in a voice gone rough from smoke and cold what he should do when roads opened and accounts were called. Cole handed him a split maul and told him to finish the cord in front of him, then report at evening count with his inventory books so weights could be reconciled against remaining stores and needs for the next 3 days. Aid was still being asked. Aid was still being given. The barn held, and inside it work continued. Work continued through the thinning of the storm and into the hard labor that followed a storm, which was often more exacting than the hours of immediate fear. By the morning of December 5th, Cole had divided the barn into 6 fixed stations with posted duties, and each station now carried a deputy from among the sheltering households so that no task depended on one pair of hands. Wood detail split and stacked by burn class. Water detail cut snow blocks from clean drift faces and melted them in rotation kettles. Infirm detail logged temperatures, doses, and cough intervals for 31 vulnerable souls. Sanitation detail checked trench depth and lime spread twice per shift. Ration detail weighed every issue to the ounce. Repair detail patched boots, mended gloves, and reset door braces that had begun to loosen under repeated strain. He taught while he issued. He taught while he measured. At the flour scale, he showed 3 young ranchers how to read moisture by touch before sack opening, then made them compare two barrels from different wall bays so they could feel why airflow lanes had been left clear all autumn. At the stove, he showed Pemberton how to bank coals with ash to carry heat through the darkest watch, then assigned him to demonstrate the same method to two clerks from his former store. At the stone pits, he explained to Ruth and Reverend Talbot how depth and lid insulation held medicine steady when outside air dropped below -20, and he had them record pit temperature at dawn and dusk for 3 days. He gave no speeches about foresight. He converted foresight into repeatable method. The expensive failures stood in plain contrast to these modest disciplines. Pemberton had once spent $63 on fancy coffee and sugar inventory, meant for holiday trade margins, goods that now sat clumped and damp in frost-split crates. Cole had spent less than that on extra salt, vinegar, and barrel hoops in September, and those purchases were still preserving food in December. 3 homes with ornate cast-iron parlor stoves had gone cold because their owners had bought polished fixtures and deferred coal contracts. Cole's plain sheet-iron stoves, fed steadily and cleaned on schedule, held stable interior warmth for nearly 200 souls. A prosperous ranch family had lost half its winter lard to cellar freeze because jars were packed against an outer wall without straw buffer. Cole's tallow stores remained usable because each tin had been raised, spaced, and turned. Wealth had not failed by being wealthing, it had failed by neglecting sequence. 3 days passed before the first organized salvage parties could move beyond immediate rope lines. Cole sent teams in 4s, each tied at the waist, each carrying marking stakes and a tally board, each under instruction to retrieve only what could be safely transported before wind returned. They recovered sacks of oats from 2 collapsed sheds, 1 crate of lamp chimneys from the schoolhouse cellar, and a church box of medical linens that had escaped water damage. They also recovered Martin Keene's shovel near the parsonage fence, Lydia Crow's room ledger from beneath broken rafters, and Samuel Pike's wooden toy horse from the rail-cut shack. Those items were cleaned, wrapped, and stored in a separate chest by the north post, not as supplies but as witness. No one disputed that decision. By December 12th, wind had eased to intermittent gusts, and the sky opened in brief, hard blue intervals that made the drifts glare like hammered metal. Coal teams from outlying claims managed to reach town with partial loads, and 2 rail workers arrived on handcar from the south, with word that tracks might reopen by late month if bridge crews held. Coldwater did not disperse at once. Cole insisted on staged return by block, beginning with homes that still had roof integrity and stove function, and he required each household to take a written starter allotment, calculated for 7 days before private stores were touched. He sent pairs to inspect flues before first relighting. He sent Ruth with medicine bundles to every house with chronic illness. He sent Pemberton and Eli together to check the general store cellar for spoiled stock, an assignment that forced old status and plain labor into one harness. During those inspections, the reckoning began in the way such reckonings often begin, not in a hall but at thresholds. A ranch hand named Caleb Dunn, the first of the 2 who had dumped spoiled hay at Cole's gate, waited by the barn door after evening count and said in a voice rough from smoke that he had called the place a grave for good sense and had laughed while doing it. He set down 2 sharpened axes and asked where they were needed next. Cole told him the west woodpile needed squaring before nightfall. Dunn nodded and went to work without further appeal. The second hand, Arlo Vance, came the next day with 3 fence posts and admitted he had repeated Pemberton's nickname to boys in the street. He asked no pardon. He asked how to set guide knots that could be felt with numb fingers. Cole showed him twice, then had him teach 3 others. By the first week of January 1889, with temperatures still severe but roads intermittently passable, households began bringing payment in material rather than coin. Boards, seed sacks, iron scrap, cured hides, labor pledges written and signed. They did not bring these to erase debt, because no ledger entry could erase Martin Keene, Lydia Crow, or Samuel Pike. They brought them because they had seen a method keep 267 surviving souls alive, and they understood that memory without structure would fail again. Eli Hale proposed a weekly work roster for expanding shared storage. Reverend Talbot offered church outbuildings for dry goods, overflow under Cole's standards. 2 school teachers requested a copy of the ration mathematics for winter arithmetic lessons. Coldwater was learning to confess by adopting discipline. The most difficult admission came from Silas Pemberton, and it came before witnesses because his earlier mockery had been public. On January 18th, he stood beside the ration board after noon issue, coat hanging loose on a frame reduced by labor and short meals, and asked leave to speak while Cole continued weighing flour. The room stilled. Pemberton said he had charged one young man $7 for flour, that he sold others for $4.25, because he believed market standing gave him the right to punish caution he did not understand. He said he had called the barn Thornton's empty stable, when it was in truth the only full place in Coldwater, when fullness mattered. He said his shelves had gone bare in 2 days, his cold judgment had failed, and his pride had cost the town confidence, when confidence was already a thin ration. Then he turned toward Cole and said, "I was wrong in public, and I ask in public to learn your inventory discipline if you will permit it." Cole did not stop his hands. He finished the measure, tied the sack, and set it in the issue lane before he answered. He said Pemberton could begin at dawn by recopying the entire winter ledger in duplicate, weight for weight, loss for loss, and then spend 1 month issuing under supervision to households that owed him money before the storm, and households that did not. He said instruction would be offered if performed, not praised. Pemberton accepted the terms without bargaining. No single night settled the town's account with itself. The reckoning continued in increments through February and into the thaw season. Nora Keene came to the barn with her daughter from Laramie and asked to see the ledger line where Martin's name had been written. She stood in silence for a long while, then donated her husband's carpenter tools to the shared build. Daniel Crow, still weak but recovering, brought Lydia's boarding ledger and asked that her careful credit columns be copied into the town reserve books as a reminder that ordinary diligence was also a form of care. Owen Pike took the first volunteer shift each week on rope maintenance and never missed one, even when his hands cracked and bled in the cold. Grief did not fade into sentiment. It was set to work. When roads fully reopened in March 1889, Coldwater held no stage ceremony and raised no triumphant banner. Instead, on March 23rd, 37 households formed a line at the ridge lot and delivered what had been pledged: 74 planks, 11 kegs of nails, 9 bushels of seed grain, 2 wagon loads of stone, 6 coils of rope, and 2 months of rotating labor from every able family. Each head of household spoke 1 sentence before placing their contribution. Some named the words they had used in ridicule. Some named the day they finally took the guide rope. Some named the dead. The admissions were brief, unadorned, and complete. Only after the line had ended did they ask Cole to speak. He stood with Asa Thornton's ledger in both hands, pages swollen from damp and use, and answered in the same measured tone with which he had issued rations all winter. He said his father taught him that provisions in hard weather were a commons, not a weapon, and that no town could eat pride, argument, or memory of easy seasons. He said he would not pretend words had not done harm, because they had, and he would not distribute easy forgiveness as if it were lamp oil from a tin. He said forgiveness worth having would be measured in October inventories, in repaired roofs, in coal ordered before the first freeze, in guidelines posted before the first drift, and in whether the sick and the poor were counted first when stores were set. He said he would teach any soul willing to learn those practices, and he would continue teaching until Coldwater no longer required one stubborn barn to keep it alive. By the second week of October 1889, the first of the new dual-use barns stood on Lower Street with insulated walls, raised slats, and marked ration bays copied from Cole's plan at smaller scale. By autumn 1891, 7 such structures served different blocks of town, each with posted reserve counts and assigned stewards. The phrase "building like Thornton" entered common use without irony. Children who had once shouted "empty stable" now learned knot counts and moisture checks and schoolyard drills before winter. Pemberton, having sold controlling share of his store to settle speculation debts, kept a narrow counter for staple trade and hung beside it a slate listing fair seasonal prices and reserve contributions due each household. He did not return to polished certainty. Years later, travelers on the spur remarked that Coldwater's barns looked plain compared with newer towns that favored ornament. Yet those same travelers noticed that Coldwater's shelves stayed steadier in bad years, and that no widow or orphan was turned from winter issue for lack of coin. Eli Hale and Ruth, grown into a skilled apothecary keeper, maintained medicine pits in 3 districts. Reverend Talbot's successor taught annual remembrance by reading 3 names each first snow: Martin Keene, Lydia Crow, Samuel Pike. Not as warning alone, but as obligation. Decades pass, rails change, and storefront signs weather away. The barn on the Alkali Ridge still stands. Its double walls remain tight where sawdust was packed dry. The stone pits remain cool in summer and steady in winter. Asa Thornton's ledger, copied and recopied by many hands, remains in a locked cabinet with margins darkened by use. Each autumn, before the first hard freeze, Coldwater stewards gather in that aisle, call out weights, mark dates, test ropes, inspect flues, and teach apprentices the old order of needs. They still say "building like Thornton" when they mean building for all souls, not for show. They say it with respect and with memory, and with the humility that survival finally taught them. The lanterns had nearly burned to their lower marks when Cole closed Asa Thornton's ledger and looked up at the circle of stewards in the aisle, all of them waiting with chalk dust on their sleeves and cold on their boots, all of them old enough now to know that memory faded unless tied to procedure. He handed the book to Ruth Hale, who had become the surest copyist in Coldwater, and told her to read the reserve counts back from the duplicate so errors could be caught before winter made correction costly. She read each line by bay number and weight. Eli Hale verified each figure at the scale. Silas Pemberton, standing beside the lamp tins, repeated the totals aloud and marked variance in a narrow column with a hand that had once written prices for advantage and now wrote them for fairness. When the final count matched, Cole crossed to the north post and unlocked the witness chest that had remained sealed except on first snow evenings. He laid out Martin Keene's shovel, Lydia Crow's boarding ledger, and Samuel Pike's wooden toy horse on a clean plank table, not as relics for spectacle, but as fixed reminders that warning ignored became loss measured in names. Nora Keene, gray at the temples and steady in her bearing, touched the shovel handle and said she wanted it hung in the rope shed, where every youth learning crossings would see it before taking a line into weather. Daniel Crow, still carrying a slight stiffness from that winter collapse, requested that Lydia's ledger remain in active use as the model for credit entries in all shared stores, because her columns were honest and exact, even when times were lean. Owen Pike stood silent for a moment, then asked that Samuel's toy horse be placed in the schoolhouse cabinet each winter, beside the knot board, so children could tie practice lines knowing why delay was never a private choice. Before closing the witness page, Ruth read aloud the corrected steward minute for December 4th, 1888. The storm death was Samuel Pike, age 9, son of Owen Pike, and Owen Pike survived and remained on Coldwater's labor rolls. Cole agreed to all 3 requests, and Ruth entered each disposition in the margin under the date. By October 16, 1892, the town had adopted a rule that no reserve structure could close its doors for the season until a full public audit had been read in open hearing, and that evening the church benches filled with ranch families, railmen, widows, apprentices, and 3 elders who had mocked the first barn the loudest. There was no platform speech prepared, only a long table with ledgers and scales. Pemberton rose first because he had asked for that burden. He stated his inventory, his losses, and his shortfalls without softening language. Then he added what he had never said plainly in the first reckoning, that the rail clerk's September notice in 1888 had included a second line he chose not to post on the outer board, a line warning that bridge timbers had failed at 2 points and that coal priority might be diverted east. He admitted he had read it, judged it damaging to his credit sales, and kept it to himself. The room held stillness like held breath. Eli Hale asked whether anyone else had seen the full dispatch. The former clerk, Jonah Reese, raised his hand and answered yes, then said he had kept silent because he feared losing wages. Ruth wrote both statements into the town record. No one shouted. The shame in the room required no volume. Cole was asked to answer, and he did not step to the front. He stood where he had stood all evening, beside the scale, and spoke toward the table so the words traveled with the ledgers and not above them. He said concealed information in frontier weather was not sharp dealing, but breach of duty, because supply knowledge belonged to every household whose survival depended on timing. He said confession had value only if it altered conduct before the next storm. He set terms. Every freight notice would be copied in full by 2 hands and posted at rail office, church door, and school wall. Every merchant contract for coal and staple grain would be declared by quantity and delivery date. Every household would appoint 1 winter runner trained on guidelines and ration math. He said no soul would be barred from issue for debt during declared weather emergency, and no merchant would set emergency prices above pre-declared winter rates without review by the steward board. He did not call these punishments. He called them structure. 3 days later, Pemberton arrived at dawn in the Ridge barn with 2 ledgers under his arm and asked Cole where to begin restitution that could be counted, not merely spoken. Cole gave him the older September book and instructed him to calculate the difference between inflated and fair prices charged to every household during the 1888 panic period, including the $7 flour charged to 1 buyer when others paid $4.25. By noon, Pemberton had a list with names and amounts. By evening, he had signed transfer notes surrendering remaining speculation shares and 2 storage lots to the Commons Trust Coldwater had formed after the storm. The next market day, he stood behind his own counter and issued credit slips against that list, each stamp redeemed as households presented them for nails, seed, lamp oil, and flour. Some accepted in silence. Some nodded once. None called it grace. It was repair. On November 2nd, 1893, a hard front dropped temperatures from 34 degrees at dawn to -9 by nightfall, and drifts began to form in the same gullies that had swallowed tracks 5 years earlier. This time, guidelines were already tensioned before noon. Coal bins were full under posted seals, and reserve keys sat in 3 separate hands. Ruth opened medicine pits in District 2 and District 3 without waiting for requests. Eli inspected flues by block and tagged unsafe stacks with red cloth until repaired. School children moved in pairs to knot stations and returned by route count, reciting 17 knots to well, 29 to smithy, doubled knot at turn. The weather still struck like a weapon. Coldwater met it with order. No household froze out that week. No child was carried to the infirm lane in damp quilts after Pride delayed action. The difference was not luck. It was learned discipline. In spring of 1896, when rail service resumed after another washout season, the North Platte office sent a packet of archived telegram copies requested by Coldwater's stewards to settle long-disputed details from the 1888 failures. Ruth read them at the Ridge table while Cole and Pemberton checked dates against surviving local entries. The concealed line about coal diversion was there exactly as Pemberton had confessed. The bridge failure durations were worse than rumor and matched Cole's early estimates within 1 day. The packet was sealed and stored in the cabinet with Asa Thornton's original ledger and Lydia's copybook, labeled for any future steward who might be tempted to treat warnings as bargaining tools. External reports had been answered. Records were complete. On January the 7th, 1901, after Eli Hale was buried on a clear, bitter morning at 5 degrees, the stewards gathered without him for the first time and found his last work waiting in the rope shed. 6 new line reels, each tagged by route and knot count, and a note in his blocky hand instructing that beginners always train in calm weather until fingers could read knots with eyes shut. Cole read the note aloud once and placed it under glass beside Martin Keene's shovel. Ruth took Eli's place at the audit table and did not miss a figure. Cole never married, never sought office, and never left the ridge lot for easier country. He taught by assigning tasks, by correcting measures, by refusing vague assurances where weights were required. When younger stewards asked him years later whether he had forgiven Coldwater for the winter they had called his work folly, he answered that forgiveness was not a receipt one stamped once and filed. It was a practice proven before storms, in August purchases and October repairs and November postings done on time. If the work held, the question held less power. If the work slipped, the question returned. The barn on alkali ground still stands. Its double planks remain tight. The sawdust fill remains dry where inspection bores are made each September. The stone pits hold steady temperature through both heat and severe cold. Martin Keene's shovel hangs in the rope shed. Lydia Crow's ledger is still the training text for fair credit columns. Samuel Pike's toy horse sits each winter in the school cabinet beside the knot board, and every child in Coldwater is told whose hands once held it and why they do not wait out warnings in Pride. On first snow evenings, stewards still gather in that aisle and call counts by bay number, while apprentices mark the duplicates. They post freight notices in full text at 3 doors. They inspect flues, test lines, and verify medicine stock before the first hard freeze. They still use one phrase when a structure is plain, overbuilt and meant for all souls rather than display. Building like Thornton,